Welcome to Books to Africa on Air, where we discuss a variety of topics with a special focus on Africa. I'm your host, Caroline Lele, and today we'll be discussing the topic, African Literature from a Global Perspective. This episode will be looking at the contributions of Professor Molly Mahood to the evolution of African literature, with a focus on the strengths and weaknesses of African literature from a global perspective. Joining me today is Professor Lyn Innes, Professor Emeritus at the University of Kent in Postcolonial Literatures. Welcome, Professor Innes.
Well, thank you, Caroline, and I'm delighted to be here, and I'm a great supporter of Books to Africa, which I think is doing wonderful work.
We're very glad to have you. So just to get started, Professor, would you tell us a little bit about what ignited your passion and has fueled your passion for African literature over the years?
Well, it goes back to the 1960s when I was teaching in the United States, and I got a job in 1968 in Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, which was then regarded as a black university and a very prestigious one. The students were very anxious to know about African writers and African American writers, so I began to read them and was completely overwhelmed by how wonderful some of those writers were. And I was also very interested in the ways in which writers sought not just to reflect a society, but to change it and to help create a new society.
Oh, that's lovely. So in terms of your experience, would you say you have a favorite African author? And why would that particular individual be a favorite? Or do you have a variety of authors that you...
Yes, there are a number of writers that I admire a lot from Africa. But I think my favorite, or I know my favorite writer, is Chinua Achebe. It was his first novel, Things Fall Apart, which really struck me as being quite extraordinary. And then I had the very good fortune to work at the University of Massachusetts when he was there, and both to attend the lectures he gave there, but also he asked me to work with him as a co-editor on the journal Okiki, which he was the founding editor of. So I got to know him, but more importantly, perhaps, I got to know his writing.
Would you say at that point you had an idea of just how broad his continued impact and legacy in African literature was going to be as it evolved, or what was your perception of his impact?
That's an interesting question. I think my first interest in him was I did my doctoral dissertation in where I compared him with Irish writers like Yeats and Synge. And I was interested in how he was actually reacting to and responding to writers like Joyce Carey and Conrad. But I think at that point I was aware that he was a very exciting writer, a very interesting writer, but I don't think I was aware that he had so much impact on other writers in Africa, and that he would become so significant worldwide.
Along with himself, perhaps, were there any at that point, any other high-profile or well-known African-American authors that you were also interested in?
Well, I was very interested in Langston Hughes, the poet. I thought was a wonderful poet. And Gwendolyn Brooks, who is another poet I admire tremendously. I read, of course, Richard Wright and James Baldwin. And I was very interested, as I got to know Achebe, to know that how much he admired Baldwin and had been inspired by him as a writer too.
I suppose starting off as a writer in that time when he started off in writing, I suppose being a novelist, being an author is something that has developed over the years in terms of African culture. African culture has a history and a heritage of storytelling and of communicating in that manner, but probably not so much a profile in being an author as something that is seen as an established career, I suppose. You know, he was starting off a trend that was not very popular at that point of becoming an African author and presenting African literature positively. How would you say you've seen the reception of African literature develop over the years because of authors like Chinua Achebe and, as you've mentioned, Ngugi wa Thiong'o from Kenya and others?
Well, I guess yes. When I decided that I wanted to study African literature at doctoral level, I wrote to 25 universities in America to ask to say that what I wanted to do was this comparative study of Irish and African sort of cultural nationalist writers, and 24 of them wrote back and said, you know, that is not possible. There isn't such a thing as African literature, and certainly not at PhD level. It's not something you could study. One university, Cornell University, wrote back and said, this is really an exciting thing to do, and they gave me a scholarship. And so that's an indication of what it was like back in 1969, 1970. In terms of acceptance.
Yes.
And then, of course, since then, Black studies became quite established in lots and lots of American universities and subsequently in English ones. By the time I finished my doctorate in 1973, Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart had become known and accepted. And he had been invited to become a professor at the University of Massachusetts. So just 3 years later, there had been an interesting change.
Yeah.
And University of Massachusetts had a very thriving Black Studies department with all kinds of people, including Bill Cosby as one member of its faculty. There were students, you know, who were thronging to listen to Achebe talk about his work and so on.
Would you say at that point the demographic of students was quite varied in terms of, were there a lot of African background students interested in African literature, or what was the distribution like?
Well, in universities like Tuskegee, of course, and Howard University, there was a very strong interest, especially among students, although a lot of the staff were very conservative and actually discouraged the teaching of African American and African literature because they had really taken on board the notion that African writers were inferior. And it was only it tended to be more in the northern universities that African literature was studied, but it was still studied from a kind of anthropological point of view. Right. That is, anthropology departments were taking it as something interesting and looking at Things Fall Apart, but
not from a literature.
But not so much from a literary point of view. And even when I went to Chinua Achebe's lectures, and when he talked about the literature, the students would say, well, you know, would you explain this ritual to me, or would you talk about cannibalism or whatever? So the students still took these novels to be really about another kind of world and had very stereotyped versions of Africans in their mind, even though they were still reading those novels.
Yes. Yeah. So it's taken, you know, quite a lot of change and transition to move from seeing African literature, as you say, from an anthropological perspective, to actually accepting it at par with other authors and with other Western writers and contributors in that sense.
Yes, I think it has taken a very long time, and there was, of course, Wally Soyinka won the Nobel Prize back in '87, and that was quite a big move because he was the first black writer to have been awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. But even then, you know, there were a lot of American writers like Saul Bellow who were very snooty about the whole idea that there was such a thing as African literature.
Every day, millions of good books are thrown away. Yet 50% of people who go to school in Africa will not be able to read or write properly because they have no books. Books to Africa collects donated books and send them to projects in Africa. You can donate your books, fund a container shipment to Africa, or become a dedicated sponsor. Please do not throw your books away. Go to www.bookstoafrica.org to get involved. Thank you.
So, from your experience, having been able to see the variety and the transition from a resistance and almost a dismissing of African literature to modern day perspectives of African literature, where do you see African literature contributing or sitting in terms of the global perspective in its contribution towards global appreciation of literature? What place does African literature now have in that dialogue?
Well, I think it's incredibly important, because I would agree with W.E. Du Bois, and I would agree with Chinua Achebe that one of the huge major problems globally is racism, and that the whole attitude towards Africa and Africans, and to some extent towards India and China, has created, you know, a great deal of the extraordinary inequalities and upheavals that are characteristic of the world now. So I think that insofar as reading African literature is a way of countering that racism, of making people see and understand the real and utter humanity of African peoples, then I think it's absolutely vital. And I think it is important also in that it counters the kinds of books like Conrad's Heart of Darkness, Joyce Carey's Mr. Johnson, which in fact were the books which Chinua Achebe, in a sense, encountered when he was a student, and which he decided to write against or to rewrite, so that an African perspective was created. So that for me is very, very important. The other related thing is it allows one to see the language from another kind of perspective. That the way in which you realize that terms like black and white are loaded, and loaded in an unacceptable way. So writers like Achebe are very strong in making one look carefully at language and look carefully at the ways in which stories are told and ways words are used, so that you have to rethink your own thoughts as well.
Which is something that is very important, as you're saying, getting the individual to have a broader perspective of the world, you know, and to step outside of their own perhaps limited view of experiencing different peoples, different cultures, you know, and it's interesting to see that, yes, literature has an immense power in being able to, as it were, nullify or at least to dilute some of those impressions or ideas that people might have, and to introduce a knowledge and an awareness of something greater and something beyond just the individual, and as it were, emphasize this idea of we are just one, different, but we are one, and one doesn't necessarily mean better than the other, just different, and being able to celebrate that through literature and through books and through stories and through, as you say, being able to see the world through somebody else's eyes. So let's talk briefly about your colleague, Professor Molly Mahood, who passed away recently, and who was also a very influential part of this whole dialogue on literature and contributing to it. How did you meet Professor Mahood, and what was she like?
Well, I met Molly when I first came to the University of Kent, and that was in 1975. And I was actually taking a boat trip along the Stour River with my partner, who was already teaching at the University of Kent. And she had a house which overlooked the river. Mm-hmm. And as we went by in the boat, she stepped out and she said, "Oh, you must come to lunch," both of you.
As you do.
And that was my first meeting with Molly. Mm. But I had, of course, already heard of her because she was very well known as a Shakespearean critic and scholar. But when I did actually get the job at the University of Kent, she was incredibly encouraging and helpful. She had postgraduate students sent to me, including Abdulrazak Gurna, who is now a very wonderful novelist. Mm-hmm. But and she was one of the people who founded African and Caribbean Studies at the University of Kent, just back in the early 1970s. Mm. So and that was one of the very first sort of programs of African and Caribbean Studies at degree level in England.
Okay. Wow. So very, very significant in terms of influencing how African and Afro-Caribbean literature is received. So what, in your opinion, was Molly's most significant contribution when it comes to African literature? Of course, as you say, having been the person who spearheaded the course at the University of Kent, a lot of universities have followed suit in trying to encourage a more diverse approach to literature and literary studies. Would that be her most significant contribution, or what would you say? Is there something else that perhaps?
Well, yes, I would go back to her actual teaching in Africa. She taught in Nigeria at Ibadan College from 1954 to 1963 for 9 years, and she was the first professor of English there. And she believed, that it was important not to condescend to African students on the one hand, to make demands, to give them what she saw as the best of English writing, but she also was very much aware that this would, in a sense, provide a kind of ground for what she said would be a new and very interesting literature coming out of Africa. And that, was in fact what happened. I think. So Chinua Achebe was a student at Ibadan College. So was Wole Soyinka, and she actually found the money and got a grant for Wole Soyinka to study drama in Nigeria and to travel around, studying oral drama and traditional Yoruba drama. Yeah. So she had that very direct influence on specific students. Absolutely. And a lot of African academics, Abiola Areli, who was one of the most prestigious academics from Nigeria, working in both Francophone and Anglophone literature, was taught by her, and she encouraged them and gave them, I suppose, the confidence to go out and see African literature as something that was important to explore and write about and take seriously. And
obviously we, so many years ahead, have the benefit of having all of these extremely successful African authors and writers who've been, as it were, acknowledged for their gift and for their contribution, and have that highlighted as equally as good as, contemporary Western authors and contemporary Western writers. So it does mean a lot that she was able to have the courage to be able to bridge that gap and to speak out and be that voice in a generation perhaps, or in a time where, as you're saying, it wasn't really acknowledged or recognized or appreciated. So what would you say, in conclusion, is the relevance of charities like Books to Africa when it comes to profiling African literature and encouraging that positive perspective of African literature?
Well, I think Books to Africa, first of all, is very important in actually, I suppose, following up the kind of work Molly Mahood did in sending books of all kinds to Africans so that they actually had the resources to read and become as cosmopolitan as everybody would like to be. You know, but wherever you are, you want to be part of a whole world and to experience other views and other worlds. And I went to Nigeria not in 1985 for the first time, and what struck me as very, very sad was that the University of Nsukka the library had no books. It was following the Civil War and it had been totally depleted. And the students just simply had occasional sort of photocopied pages to look at. And this was such a sad thing, especially at the university where Chinua Achebe himself was teaching at the time, and his books weren't there. None of his books were there. So to get his books, to get Shakespeare, to get all kinds of writing, to get science books and so on available so that students in Nigeria, in Kenya, in Liberia have the same resources and the same possibilities to encounter all kinds of worlds and subjects as students in Europe. It seems to me very, very important.
And what you raise is a really critical aspect, that it's about giving access, equal access to all children and to all individuals to these resources, and to opening up knowledge.
Absolutely.
Not just restricting knowledge to particular groups or particular individuals.
Absolutely.
But opening up knowledge and then empowering people then to be able to contribute positively from that point in many ways, whether it be in science or the arts or in any other sort of kind of area that can be facilitated through books. So I really appreciate that. You've been a supporter of Books to Africa as well, and you know your voice contributes to increasing that awareness and to increasing that profile about African literature and African writing, and how it is changing lives and it is making a difference and it's bringing people together. And so we really appreciate you being on the show with us today. We appreciate your contribution to African literature, and we're very grateful for you taking the time to be with us here today.
Thank you so much, Caroline.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for joining us today on this show. If you would like to know more about Professor Molly Mahood or Professor Lyn Innes, please do follow the links below, and we'll have a bit more information for you if you'd like to get to know more about their background in the books and the publications that they have had. If you would like to know more about Books to Africa as well, we encourage you to click the link below. We have a wide variety of books and a wide variety of topics that would be very interesting for yourself, and we invite you as well to participate in the change that we are impacting in people's lives by contributing either the books that you have or in the knowledge that you have towards African literature. We thank you very much for joining us.
One of the ways you can get involved with Books to Africa is by sponsoring shipments of books to students in Africa. Every month in the UK, we collect thousands and thousands of books donated by generous donors like you. Now, the next challenge is to ship them out to Africa, to students and to schools that can't afford to buy books. With your support through a donation of £10 a month, we can ship out 50 books every month to students in Africa. Now, to make an even bigger impact, you can sponsor a container shipment with £4,000, and that will ship 20,000 books that will literally transform an entire community. So thank you for your generous support.